Hi, this is Sarah Sewell. I'm the president of IJM, and today I'm going to really quickly go over how IJM is going to facilitate discussions around hypersexualization, media, and its adverse impacts at EOE. So first, we have a guiding verse for how we're going to think about facilitating these conversations. It's 1 Corinthians 13:13, and I think 1 Corinthians has a lot to say about love and what that looks like, and I would really recommend reviewing this chapter when thinking through how we're going to have these conversations. So now faith, hope, and love abide, but these three, the greatest is love. And when we think through these conversations, the greatest thing is to communicate Christ's love for others, for us, and salvation. And any opportunity we have to present the gospel is the best case scenario. This presentation can be either secular or religious, depending on people's comfort level and context, but it really points to a lot of opportunities for what does the Bible have to say about our bodies and what they're worth. And I really would like to encourage people to connect the ideas to the gospel if they think that is something the person is comfortable and willing to listen to. So I'm going to go into what our presentation is about and some talking points and how to facilitate this conversation, then touch back on that gospel outreach at the end. But the core idea of our presentation is pretty simple. Media hypersexualization of both men and women creates adverse impacts, such as low self-esteem and warped perception of others, particularly in girls and women, sexism, and exploitative sexual relationships. So we'll have slides going in the background with some stats, key figures, and quotes to kind of convey this idea. But when thinking through conversations, the main idea is that media hypersexualization exists and it creates adverse societal outcomes such as these three. And we'll go over a theoretical model to help encompass that as well. But first, what is media hypersexualization? There's a few definitions we could give, but essentially this is the presentation of young girls, boys, or even women in a way that is focusing on their sexuality or their body as a key part of who they are. Looking at girls as sexual objects, even though they're really young women, or looking at any person as a sex object that exists for the gratification for others. So looking at their body in an exploitative way. And we see that throughout all types of media. We can see that on TV shows where they focus on the sexuality and bodies of young girls. We can see that in portraying actors' bodies in a way that probably isn't honoring to God. And for more technical definitions, you can look in this UNICEF source or the University of Tennessee Chattanooga report on the link between media hypersexualization and sexism. I think it is important to understand what we mean by media hypersexualization when facilitating these conversations. So one core idea of how this presentation is structured is that we have a specific topic to talk about. It's not just, let me talk about human trafficking, let me talk about why not is bad, let me talk about even what inherently the Bible has to say about the role of media. We have a specific topic that we'd like to talk about, and people are welcome to do their own research to supplement these. I have about 4 resources that really guide the conversation, but in order to really help our volunteers know what to talk about, we have this core idea and these 3 points. So first, low self-esteem and warped perception of others. And the key source here is the UNICEF source. I would really recommend that you read it. It will be a lot more helpful than I am. But the key idea here is that when young girls see people who are supposed to be their age, or even women, as sexual objects that exist for the gratification of others, then they feel like their bodies are not good enough. They're not skinny enough, they're not sexual enough, they're not developed enough, they're not good enough. And that can create really low self-esteem. It can create mental health issues. It can create unwanted sexual behavior. And it can also warp their perception of others. In a similar way, when young boys and teenagers see women's bodies in that way, that warps their perception of women as sexual objects, and can also create the same low self-esteem effects when seeing male bodies be hypersexualized and feeling like their bodies aren't good enough as well. So essentially, it lowers people's self-esteem and makes them misunderstand who God has created that other person to be with. So if we're talking to a Christian audience or somebody who's interested and willing to participate in faith-based conversations, this is a great way to talk about something we talk at EOE as an event with dignity. What does that look like? And why does hypersexualization derode that dignity? And something that's useful about the PowerPoint and about these sources is they're all secular, and most of them are using quantitative analysis to prove this link. So we have data from people who aren't Christians to back up what we're saying. So next, sexism. This is very much related to that first point. A lot of media hypersexualization, but certainly not all, is directed towards women as objects that exist for male gratification. So that kind of reinforces societal biases we have against women, viewing them as a sex object. And that really goes against God's design for women as like beautiful beings who do not exist for the pleasure of men, who don't exist for they have purpose and identity and image bearers in Christ, and really the deroding of their image bearerness as something that exists for other people instead of for God's glorification. But on a different level, on a more academic level, we can also see the two sources linked here talk about how media hypersexualization can reinforce gender prejudices and stereotypes. And finally, exploitative sexual relationships. So this can mean a lot of different things, but when somebody is used to consuming media about how another person's body exists for their gratification, then that can lead them to be very selfish, to be very aggressive, very violent. And we want to be very deliberate in how we talk about this, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So make sure to talk with a lot of care about exploitative sexual relationships, and make sure to feel comfortable and prepared to talk about these before you arrive at EOE. So this model comes from this Sex Roles journal, and I thought it was very helpful in understanding kind of the core idea a little better. So first, sexually objectifying media exist, and all of these are causal links. These aren't correlation links, they're causal. So first, that creates self-dehumanization for women as victims, which means that connecting to this low self-esteem point, women dehumanize themselves and view themselves as objects for other people's gratification. And that creates an acceptance of sexual harassment. So when they are harassed or even assaulted, then they accept that behavior as normal and something they deserve. So next, disruption of empathetic responses with women. That can be from women or men. And that means that perpetrators engage in sexual harassment because they don't have as much empathy for women because they've seen them as sexual objects. And also it means that bystanders aren't as likely to intervene. And finally, a negative shift in gender norms, again, can increase perpetration, can cause victims to accept harassment, and can cause bystanders to delay their intervention. So my hope here is not to be an anti-nod event, not to be an anti-nod table, but I think it's helpful to talk about what nod represents in this context to better understand the model. So for example, nod exists as an event that is pointing to people as sexual beings and perhaps objects. That's not in line with their marketing, but that is in line with the idea of some people at this event. So it's an opportunity to showcase ourselves as sexual objects. So that's a dehumanizing act for women. It's also a dehumanizing act for men, but under this model, we're focused on women, and we can broaden it out to men as well. So that creates dehumanization. It also can decrease empathy with each other because, again, we're dehumanizing them. So bystanders are less likely to intervene per se at nod than at, lunch at the commons when they see sexually aggressive behavior, because in this context, people have been dehumanized and their empathy has been lowered for sexual harassment. Finally, there's a shift in gender norms. If we go back to the history of nod, it was created by men who were trying to get women really drunk so that they could have sex with them. So again, that's heightening our tolerance for harassment. That's increasing the likelihood of perpetration and increasing the mindset that, well, you went to nod, you wore these outfits, you should accept that harassment or assault. again, we're not trying to be an anti-nod event. I just thought that was a helpful way to talk through some of the manifestations of this model. So, what do we need to be mindful of? First and perhaps foremost is victim blaming. I've linked a source that is essentially a resource guide to how to think and talk about sexual assault. If you identify any ways that you're uncomfortable or unknowledgeable in talking about assault, I think it's a great resource to go over. Essentially, we want to make sure that we're being deliberate with our language. First, I think the word rape can be jarring, unnecessary, and unproductive. So I would recommend using sexual assault and sexual harassment as these two more neutral, more society accepted terms. Second, we never ever want to suggest that because somebody has consumed sexually objectifying media, produced it, or engaged within any ways, that they are somehow complicit in their assault. Again, part of this model shows that the existence of hypersexualization actually leads to the acceptance of assault, which is something we're trying to decrease. We're trying to encourage people to be active bystanders, to acknowledge that they have been harassed and that that's not okay, and to take action against that if they're comfortable, and not to be perpetrators. So in no way do we want to say the people who are going to nod are putting themselves at risk of being assaulted. Instead, we want to say that the existence of these cultural factors that drive nod unfortunately create an environment that create harassment. So the emphasis is on this media, on this cultural phenomenon, not on the individual person. In the same way, you never want to say that you don't want to write off the actions of an accuser or an assaulter. This part is really important. You really don't want to say that somebody views a hypersexualized piece of media about how women are objects and that causes them to be an assaulter. That is a little bit too simple, and it really takes away their accountability. So we want to maintain accountability on the person who's assaulting, but talk about how that media can warp their mind and cause them to take these really selfish, aggressive, violent actions that are not okay. It's an explanation, a partial explanation, but not an excuse. And especially, I think this might be a little controversial, but take this in good faith. We have to be aware that if you are a man talking to a woman, there's going to be a little bit of a societal divide and taboo around talking about these things. And you need to be really careful of your language, just because it's possible that person has some experiences you don't know about, and this conversation can be triggering for them. So again, nothing wrong with being a male volunteer. You don't need to feel like you are guilty. You're not guilty by association for being a man. I think that's a problem I've encountered in the past with that mindset. But just be mindful. You don't know what that other person is bringing into that conversation, and gender can create a barrier that we want to be mindful of. So next, oversimplification. We don't want to say that hypersexualized media is the cause of all these societal woes. First of all, that's not true. Sin is the underlying issue here. One way that sexual sin manifests itself is in sexually objectifying media, which is also driven by economic greed. So people might ask, okay, so why does this hypersexualized media even exist? And what are some examples? Some examples would be like music videos like by men that have women as props in the background, that show children as sexual objects, even though they're young teens, that show women as sexual objects and that really focus on their bodies. I can think of some movies, probably aren't very high quality film, where they're literally just panning over a woman's body to illustrate it as beautiful. And they do that to men's bodies as well. That's not furthering the plot. That's just exploiting somebody's body for the visual gratification of others. And that happens for men and women. And also, if it comes up, you can talk about pornography as like the obvious extreme of hypersexualized media. That's not what this presentation is going for. This is more going for media that we don't even seek out, that's on our TVs, that's on our radios. Some things that we'll have in the slides are like song lyrics that are extremely graphic and degrading to other people, saying that just anything that reinforces this idea that somebody's body is a sexual object that exists for the gratifications of others is a hypersexualized piece of media. So, and finally, misinformation. If you don't have a source for a fact, don't say it. If you're talking about personal experience, make sure to clarify that. And when we're talking about the Bible, we need to really clarify, this is what the Bible says, this is my opinion, this is IJM's take. The Bible does not talk about the impacts of hypersexualized media in the 21st century, and likewise, we should not claim that it does. And so we want to say that the Bible talks about sexual sin, it talks about viewing other people selfishly, it talks about total depravity, and it talks about the dignity of a person and being created in God's image. So we want to clarify that. And then finally, how are we going to facilitate these conversations? First, get to know the person. This is a relational event. It's totally okay if somebody comes up and doesn't want to talk about this, and we don't ever have a conversation with them. We just get to know them. Next, I would ask them what brings them to EOE, or possibly like if they say, oh, I didn't want to go to NOD, ask them why. Like try to say, oh, that makes you uncomfortable. That's tell me more about that. So we're just trying to create a connection point to the subject. It's not somebody you want somebody to sit down and say, can I talk to you about hypersexualization in media and its adverse effects, right? They'll be like, I did not sign up to go to this Christian lecture at 10 p.m. I'm here for the free food. But if somebody says, I wanted to have a good time tonight, but I didn't want to go to NOD because it made me uncomfortable, then you can say, oh, really? Like, tell me more about that. What makes you uncomfortable? And then say, I'm actually a part of an organization called International Justice Mission. And part of our goal with this is to talk about media and sexuality and kind of some issues we see there. Do you see any issues? And maybe they'll be like, no, I don't. And they'll be like, I think that this media is really empowering. And you can say, I'd love to discuss that more. And talk about, well, here's what I think. What do you think? And then you're having a conversation, but trying to invite them to join this conversation instead of forcing them to. Another thing you can ask is, what clubs on campus are you a part of? A lot of Christians, this is, I think, a better way than asking, oh, are you a Christian? Because then somebody's going to say no, and they're going to be like, oh, I said the wrong thing in the situation. Instead, they can say, oh, I'm a part of CREW, I'm a part of Chi Alpha, I'm a part of RUF, or I'm a part of the Hindu Student Association, the South Asian Association, the Jewish Association. I'm a part of Club Tennis. I'm a part of the swim team. So that gives us a feel for who this person is and kind of where they're coming from in a lot of ways. And then finally, after you ask that, you can say, this table is from an anti-trafficking group on campus, and we're really trying to talk about media sexualization. And again, try to invite their thoughts. Disagreement is not a bad thing. And at the end, if people are really interested, we will have a sign-up sheet for more information to connect them to IJM, just anything that they need. And one final thought that I forgot to mention is, if people ask for media if the thresher comes pretty much and they say, can I interview you about this booth? I would like you to say, I would like you to reach out to Sarah Sewell as the president. So here's my contact information. First of all, I'm a senior. I'm, getting threshered is whatever. And I also have put a lot of thought into what I have to say about this presentation. And I don't want anyone to be put on the spot at the event, say, hey, we're actually really focused on our booth right now. If you would like to, you can reach out to our president, Sarah Sewell, and she'd be happy to sit down and explain what our hopes here are in depth. And they'll also give me some time to prepare some statements. I really don't want to, distract from this by focusing on an interview. And second, I don't want anyone to feel like they need to be on guard during that conversation. Instead, say, no, if you would like to, off the record, I'm happy to talk through our presentation with you just like you would with anyone else. But when it comes to specific quotes, I really think it would be wise to not engage with the thresher. And again, I don't know if they're going to come. I think that it's a possibility. I think that in the past they have run articles about it and that they are interested in this event. So it's a possibility. And if I'm there, I might say, sure, we can, if there's another volunteer, I'll say, sure, do you want to step aside and we can talk about it? Then I don't know, but that's my final thought. So that's all press and queries. And then we'll also ensure that it's clear that I'm speaking as IJM, not as Chi Alpha, as RUF, as something else. So thank you for watching this video. Once you complete it, you're good to sign up. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. and we'll be sharing those slides shortly. I really recommend looking over these resources, and thank you so much for your time. God bless.